So in this video we're going to discuss how the SAT is scored. So how do they translate whatever you do on test day to the various scores that are reported to colleges? So there are three sections on the SAT. There's the math, there's the critical reading, and the writing. And each of these are reported to colleges and on your score reports as scores between 200 to 800. So they're very weird scores. You know, this is not a 1 to 100 system that you're potentially used to. It's not a letter system. It's a numerical system, and it's kind of a weird numerical system. Now, how do they actually get these scores? Well, what they do is they're converting what are called the raw score for each section into these scores by a table that I'm going to show you in just a little bit. So the question now asks, well, how do they get your raw score? So let's look at the math section, for instance. For every question you get right, you get +1. For every question you omit, so this is a right, for every question you omit, you're going to get no points. And then here's the key difference from what you're used to. For every wrong question you get, so every time you put an answer down and you get it wrong, you actually get an extra quarter point off. So your raw score for the math, and this applies for the critical reading, and it applies for the grammar multiple choice questions, this scoring system. So what's different about this is not only are you getting obviously 0 for an omit, but you're actually getting an extra quarter of the point off for your wrong. So your raw score for these sections is not going to simply be equal to your rights. It's going to be equal to your rights minus a quarter times the number that you got wrong. That is, you put an answer down like B and the answer was D. So what they do is they count up your raw score for each of those sections, and then they look at this score conversion table. So pretty much, let's take a look at the reading. So let's say in a reading section, critical reading, you get, so there's 67 questions here. Let's say you get, I don't know, 42 right and 8 wrong. And then how many would it be? So 17 omits. That's a little crazy, but it's okay. So let's pretend you did that. Well, you get +42 for your rights, but then you get a minus a quarter for each of these 8 wrongs. So that would be -2. And then these 17 omits are just 0. So your final raw score would be 40. And that would translate into, according to this table, 560. Now this table differs from every test. The particular curve is going to depend on how well people do on the test. So this means if the test is easier than normal, that will be reflected in this curve. So don't think that one test is going to be easier than another. So if you take it in this time, you take it in the summer, it'll be easier than the fall. That doesn't make any sense, because if it's easier for you or if it's harder for you, it's that way for everybody, and the curve is just going to reflect that. Let's take a look at a math. Let's say your raw score in the math section was, I don't know, 27. Well, then that would translate into a 530. And note how, because there are more questions in the math or in the reading, the curve is, or I should say, the score would be lower if you got 27 right for the 480. So not only is it test dependent, but it's also section dependent. And then also for the writing, this is not exactly useful for our purposes. It just gives you a general idea of what you would get on the writing section. What we really need to look at for the writing section is this, because if you remember, the writing section is both grammar and the essay. Now your essay is graded from 0 to 12, and let's say you got 34 for your raw score in the grammar, and let's say you got an 8 on your essay. Well, that would combine to give you a 570 on the actual section. So the writing section is scored a little bit differently than the other two, just because you have this essay to mix in. But the principle is the same, right? You just essentially follow a table. Now I got these tables from the 2011-2012 SAT. Each SAT, like I said, is going to have its own table. So you can't use this for a definite guide as to what you need to get for a particular score on any test, but it's a good general guideline, I guess. I mean, an example why this would matter is sometimes at the very top of the scale, sometimes you'll see, you can get 3 off and still get or 2 off and still get an 800. Sometimes you can only miss 1 and get an 800. So, for instance, you'll see the difference at the top and at the bottom sometimes. That's kind of where you see a lot of the main differences. So if you're looking for an 800, don't think, oh, okay, I can miss 2 reading questions and still be okay. That may be true in some circumstances, but not true in others. So that's essentially how the SAT is scored. So you're scored from 200 to 800 in each section, and then each one of those scores, so let's say you get a 500 math, 490 reading, and a 410 writing, and a 610 reading, that would combine together to give you a 1600 composite score. And often this is what you'll hear people talking about, but in reality it's these scores that really matter. The actual breakdowns are what schools are really going to look at, especially if you're going for a particular kind of program. So that is essentially how the SAT is scored.